The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Tonight is a deep dive into DARPA, which is a very different model. And, we've kind of talked around DARPA, but we talked about snippets of some of the stuff that we're going to be going through. But tonight will be kind of a deep dive into looking at this model. And the model is an important one because we've gotten so much out of DARPA. It's been a remarkable run. And so we'll look at the kind of foundational period. And there are a lot of good MIT stories in here, which we'll get on the table. But we'll also try to frame really how this organization, institution kind of functions. So this is a JCR Licklider story, one of MIT's all-time greats. And he doesn't get talked about that much at MIT, but he really is foundational. And he comes in at a time when computing is really completely different than it is today, and is able with his team at DARPA to really work through really in an intergenerational between DARPA program manager and office director generations, really rework the entire sector. So we've talked a little about Whirlwind and SAGE earlier, and just to remind you, this was one of the foundational early computer systems. This was MIT's at Whirlwind and SAGE, and this is Jay Forrester, and he's holding the magnetic core memory that he and one of his graduate students came up with, which enabled real-time computing, a really critical advance. And you start to see at Whirlwind in the upper left, which merges into the SAGE system, you start to see where computing is going. So, that picture of this computer operator, this lady sitting in front of a keyboard in front of a cathode ray screen, that's this, right? And there it is, right? There it is at late 40s, early 50s when this is going on. And, how did this all evolve? So on the lower left is George Valley, who is an MIT faculty member. He was part of the RAD lab. And Valley is on a scientific advisory board to the Air Force, and he sounds the alarm, essentially alerting the Air Force and frankly the military in general, that the Soviet Union has developed a long-range bombing aircraft. They have nuclear weapons, and they have therefore first strike capability. There is absolutely nothing in their way of reaching the northern part of the United States. And that's a terrifying realization moment. So Valley gets the Air Force mobilized around an air defense mission. And computers are going to be at the heart of it. And he goes to Jay Forrester, who is developing this Whirlwind system for the Navy. The Navy is canceling Whirlwind. So Valley just moves Forrester and the team and the Whirlwind system over to this SAGE project of developing an air defense and controllers. And the picture here is what, essentially what the picture looks like of all these different kind of defense systems, from early missiles and, artillery and fighter aircraft, all being linked into a communications and computer system. And then fascinatingly, the communications lines are across phone lines, right? So the computers are running a communication system that comes into them across phone lines. That picture of those Air Force airmen sitting in front of cathode ray screens, they're holding this peculiar thing. It's a light gun, it's the mouse, right? So you start to see these iconic pictures of where all this stuff that we just live with, right, where it all starts to come from. And a lot of it came from the Whirlwind and SAGE systems. Whirlwind and SAGE, MIT doesn't want to go into the business of manufacturing computers. So they make the initial computers for the SAGE system, but they don't want to be in the computer manufacturing business. So the SAGE system becomes the IBM 700 series. This is how IBM really starts to scale up in mainframe computing and starts building the computing systems for this air defense system. So again, it's an example of long-term patient military support for technology development that we've seen before. And here it is again, only this time it's sponsoring computing. So Mitch Waldrop's book, The Dream Machine, I think is really the classic on the evolution of the information age. It is full of wonderful stories, and I feel that it's really well written, and I couldn't resist giving you a big dose of it. But there's a lot of great MIT stories in here, but lots of great stories about the foundation of where computing came from and how it arrived. That fits with the material that we've been covering in class. So we'll go through some of this key stuff, and then Steph will lead us in some Q&A. Computing before Licklider, it's not interactive, it's not fun, it's not exciting, it's behind glass walls, and you'd be met by like these high priests and priestesses who are wearing white coats and gloves, and you'd carry your stack of punch cards in, and you'd hand over this offering of punch cards. Maybe the high priest or priestess paid attention to you and took the cards from you in a few minutes, right? Maybe that happened. And then they would tell you, fine, you're 479th online, come back in a week and we'll have run this for you, right? This is not real-time computing, right? That's literally the way it was like. It was just very forbidding, it was very distant. It's definitely not what we have now. And it's built for number processing bureaucracies initially in government, but then in business. And that's not to knock mainframes. They're a huge, remarkable technical advance. IBM starts to dominate that sector, and they incorporate the machinery that they're familiar with, right? So long prior, they're building business machines that are punch card run with batch processing. So they carry those technologies into the mainframe computers that they're building. Now look, you come back after a week and you get handed a stack of this kind of weird green and white paper with holes punched in the side. You probably don't have any memory of this, but I remember it deeply. And you get handed this stack of paper, and then you'd go back to your office and you sit down and go through, and then you realize that after page 39, it's all gibberish because one of your punch cards was out of order or upside down or something like that. So then you'd have to go back and stand in line with the high priest or priestess and start the whole process all over again, right? That's really what it's like. And the emphasis was on bigger and bigger computers, right? Able to handle more and more, large number kind of batch processing. So Licklider comes along more than a decade before personal computing and 30 years before the internet. And the word computer still has this kind of ominous tone of intimidating device that's kind of hidden away in kind of this overlit, super air-conditioned, noisy, fan-ridden kind of space. And it's about as far away from this, as we can imagine. And this is really what, that team at DARPA that Licklider led drives us to. So, we'll talk about the film in a bit, but a lot of the leadership of that team goes on to do amazing stuff. So here's some Licklider photographs. This is DEX PDP-8 that was the first kind of mini computer, right? An entire movement away from mainframe computing that really was key to spawning the revolution. So Licklider is playing with this machine. It came from Digital Equipment Corporation, which is an MIT spinoff, a Lincoln Labs spinoff. And they're trying to start to pursue a more personalized kind of computing with these mini computers. That's on the lower left is the team that does the internet, right? And the only book that Licklider wrote is called Libraries of the Future. And he essentially envisions digital storage of everything, right? It's amazing work. The librarians are trying to wonder what to do with computers, and he essentially gives them the entire picture. So a very innovative kind of character. He grows up in St. Louis. Both his parents are ministers, and he's an only child, responsible kid, but his parents let him do things like assemble automobiles in the living room. For most of his life, he never spent more than $50 on a car because he would essentially buy junkers and parts and put them together himself. That's the way the family drove around. So he has a tremendous facility for, remember we talked about, mind and hand, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution. Licklider has got that tactile knowledge facility, and it's part of why he loves computers. He falls in love with psychology and becomes actually quite a significant early thinker about psychology when that whole field is starting to change. His World War II experience is spent up at Memorial Hall at Harvard in the basement with acoustics researchers studying how pilots and the crew of airplanes, how they react to this unbelievable noise that they've got in the pre-pressurized cabins in World War II aircraft with these huge propeller engines next to their ears, trying to hear radio signals. And this is before there's any kind of navigation system. It's pre-Loran, it's obviously long before GPS, so there's a terrible problem. The communication systems are the way in which you navigate a lot, particularly if you can't see the stars. So all kinds of planes get lost over oceans because the radio communications don't get picked up. So he's working on how can we improve the man-machine interface around acoustics in the cabin of airplanes. So he's thinking a lot about how people and machines work together. And that's what he contributes, right? He's not a early computer scientist, really, although he loves computing. He plays with them all the time, knows them backwards and forwards. He's bringing the ideas of a psychologist to computing. And that's what, in many ways, makes him a complete breakthrough thinker. He's able to take ideas from psychology and bring them into this early computing field, not just an engineering perspective, although he has very good engineering and physics capability. And he writes an absolutely seminal article in 1960 that essentially we're still working through his agenda of what needs to happen. It's an amazing vision. He, for example, realizes that 85% of human time is spent sort of getting into a position to be able to think about a problem, arranging all the stuff, pulling all the material together, and then you can think, right? Suppose you could reduce that 85% by having the computer do it for you, by having the computer arrange a lot of that stuff for you. That's part of his concept. The central concept he has is the hope is that human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think as no human has ever thought and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we have today. In other words, he has this vision of people and machines in this collaborative relationship. It's going to be a symbiotic kind of relationship. And let's think for a minute about how people thought about computing. Now, we're all sitting around wondering when the robots are going to take our jobs away, right? That's the obsession of the moment, right? Licklider is coming out of a time period where there was a similar obsession. And Norbert Wiener, who pops up in this book, is another one of MIT's absolute greats, a brilliant mathematician. Wiener is the one who invents the term cybernetics. And Wiener has this vision saying, look out, and he writes in the late 40s, the computers are coming, and they're going to be smarter than we are, right? It's a very dark picture of what computing is going to be. And have you all seen 2001, the HAL computer in 2001, Space Odyssey? You know of it. Well, shows my age. But that's the kind of vision, this kind of dark vision of computers kind of taking over our lives, right? And that was alive and well as early computing started to take off. And actually one of the conceptualizers who got people worrying about computing was Norbert Wiener. But along comes Licklider with his background in psychology, and he has a completely different vision. And his vision wins. Thank heavens. So he understands that things like human perception and goal setting and judgment and insight and intuition, machines can't do that. That these are incredible human attributes. And the machines are just not going to be able to equal us on that stuff, right? That certain kind of feel we have about how things fall together and shape up in place. So those qualities are going to surpass machines, but then machines are going to be able to do stuff that we can't do, that we're not particularly good at and don't want to spend a lot of time on. So there's going to be a relationship. So Licklider is spending a lot of time at Lincoln Lab, playing on computers up at Lincoln Lab. He starts to master all those early machines, including the DEC PDP-8, the first mini computer, real mini computer. He leaves the MIT psychology department and joins BB&N, which is the premier acoustics consulting firm. And you know, they do things like, you know, design the acoustics for Lincoln Center, and a famous acoustics firm. And they kind of have this idea, gee, maybe we ought to get into the computing business. You know, maybe these computers are actually here to stay. So Licklider is hired at BB&N to kind of bring them into the early computing age. And that's what he does. And he, in this 1960 article, his key image is a fig tree pollinated by a wasp. In other words, the relationship between the fig tree and the wasp is completely symbiotic. They're mutually supporting, right? And that's the vision that he has of what computing is going to be. So it's this partnership between computers and people with a complementary set of functions. The partnership has to be in real time. We have to get rid of all this batch processing stuff. That has to go. It's got to be real time. The computer is to relieve people of that drudgery factor, the 85% of the setup time we spend getting ready to think. It is a time of what is being talked about as time sharing. You know, these big, massive mainframes behind glass with the priest and priestesses dressed in white lab coats. People don't get access to them, right? It's like going to the Oracle of Delphi, right? You just can't get in there. And he has a vision of, could we, in effect, take the computer back from the Oracle of Delphi and get people on this thing? And how are we going to do that with mainframes? We're going to do it through what's called at the time time sharing. Let people have access to a share of time. And he has a vision of kind of central computers and then as a computing center with interconnected users tying into that central computing system. And it's, he understands things like building a network of people aided by computers that become, in effect, a network of thinking centers. And that network concept really is a core idea that is what his team at DARPA later establishes in BB&N as the internet. He understands that artificial intelligence is an analogous way of thinking about thinking, that it can help us understand intellectual processes. It is He has a vision of a computer being a desk console, not a mainframe. In other words, radically smaller than even the mini computer that he's starting to play with from DEC. He just has a series of these concepts in this 1960 article that kind of lays out what's going to be happening. He envisions interactive computing. He envisions programming is not just programming. He starts to understand that this is a science, in a way, a linguistic kind of science in itself, and is deserving full respect, that computer science is a true science like other sciences. That it's not just a new tool set, it's something organized around one of the fundamentals. Information is one of the fundamentals, one of the foundational building blocks of the universe, and you're organizing a whole field around information. Computing is going to be a science, and he recognizes that very, very early on, long before others. It'll have practical applications, but it's worthy of a whole intellectual field on its own. And he sees how closely tied computing can be to cognitive science. So he has a whole vision of what he calls dynamic modeling. In other words, this is an era where you get statistics on paper, right? But he has the vision that if you put them on your computer, you can start to play with each element and begin to turn them into graphs and designs and get a much more realistic feel for how the data is related and start to play with the different variables. And you're going to be able to feed hundreds and thousands of variables into your computer in a way that you could never even think of when people are kind of doing statistics by pencil and paper. So he has a whole vision of this whole, what he calls dynamic modeling, the modeling role that computing in fact plays in a very dramatic way now. It's that computing can handle this problem of complexity because of its relentless ability to deal with thousands and now millions of variables. So economics is a profession that was organized around essentially, you couldn't really handle much more than 3, 4, 5 variables operating at the same time. Computing would enable science to cope with, a profound issue like climate change and actually start to be able to model that, right? So he understands all this stuff and he starts to lay this out piece after piece after piece for people to think about. And I mentioned earlier the electronic library. He understands that all information is going to be online and stored online and is going to be accessible to everybody who can get onto one of these things. And it will be the library and it will be the reference librarian for you. In other words, it's going to be able to organize your information in ways that could never have been previously anticipated. And it's just, 15 years before the PC and 30 years before the internet, he's seeing graphics, computer-rich personal workstations, human-computer symbiosis, interactive computing, networks, the idea of an online community, a thinking community, online libraries, instant retrieval, data organization, computing language, programming that's elevated from a tool set to a true science, a whole digital medium of expression. So he is a visionary. He has this vision. He starts writing about the intergalactic network, right? It's the World Wide Web, right? Decades before Tim Berners-Lee here, pulls it off. He's a visionary and of a remarkable degree. And there's no vision champion at the time, but then DARPA hires him out of BB&N to lead, essentially this whole development of personal computing. So it's a completely rare moment where a visionary becomes the vision enabler. And it's, what happens here? So 1957 is the shock of Sputnik, so DARPA gets created. DARPA is originally given the space mission because Eisenhower is angry at the services because they weren't talking to each other, and Russians got the first satellite up, and it wasn't about a nice blinking thing. It was about first strike ballistic missile capability, right? It was very serious. But then he took space away and gave it to NASA, so DARPA had to start thinking of things to do, and they come up with a lot of creative stuff, but the big early DARPA set of accomplishments is really Licklider and his team. And so Jack Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara go through the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is, a complete nightmare. And we do things like get within 20 minutes of launching a first strike by mistake. And they realize that they've got something that they call a really serious command and control problem. And Jack Ruina, who's head of DARPA, who's another MIT faculty member, hires Licklider to come in and deal with a command and control problem. And Licklider's response to Jack Ruina is, wait a minute, I'm working on, computing and making computing personal. What do I know about the command and control problem? But they have a conversation, and Ruina starts to see that what Licklider is working on is exactly what he is concerned about, the command and control problem. All these capabilities that Licklider is thinking about, they need to tackle this command and control problem. So Licklider comes to DARPA, and because he's working on what DARPA calls a presidential, right? In other words, this is the problem the president himself, President Kennedy himself, has posed, fixed the command and control problem. He has resources. So it's a very powerful moment. Rowena hadn't really thought about the linkage between behavior and computing in the kind of way that Licklider has really thought through, but begins to see what the possibilities are. So this is really when DARPA becomes DARPA. And some of the culture of DARPA we've talked a bit about. I'll just summarize some of the rule sets. Hire great program managers that are world-class. Give them an enormous amount of power. They have the authority at DARPA. Unleash them. Let them develop a vision, and then find the best people in the country to do it. And, they're on the problem. That is not the way R&D organizations are organized in the United States. That's not the way we do it, right? We have NSF. It has, a program manager. The program manager is overseen by a peer review system. They wait for applications to come in from the scientists saying what they'd like to do. They review the applications. The peer review team makes a decision on who gets funded. The project manager is essentially doing the arranging here, but peer review makes the core decision. It's a much more bureaucratic process, and it's a bottom-up system. Now, look, there's a lot of strengths in that system. I don't want to knock that system. It's an important function to have for science so that scientists themselves can originate ideas. That's not what DARPA does. DARPA has strong program managers. They develop the ideas, and they go out and make them happen. And program managers don't last much more than 4 years at DARPA, 3 to 5 years. So they've got that period of time to get done with their project. They've got to get something happening within a relatively short period of time. So that's going to affect what they try to do. They're not working on 25-year projects at DARPA. They're working on stuff that can be stood up in a relatively short period of time. And it's just a very different organizational model for a science organization. No peer review, 2 sign-offs. If you're a program manager, you figure out what you want to do, what direction you want to go to. You sell that to your office director and to the director, and that's it. And it can be funded that day. It can move very, very fast. So they're organized around this whole grand challenge concept. DARPA doesn't want to do incremental advance. It only wants to do technology revolutionary breakthroughs that will change everything. So it doesn't want to let other people do the incremental stuff. That's not DARPA's job. And it's a right-left model. So it wants to look at what's going to come out of the pipeline, what the technology is that it wants, personal computing, and then go back into the pipeline and figure out the research that's going to get this outcome, again, within the life of the program manager, right, in this, say, 4 or 5 year period. So it's really different. Licklider pulls together, different teams. So the other thing about DARPA is that essentially the role of the program manager is to find great groups and to support them. And that's what Licklider does. So DARPA is different because it's working as an institutional entity in the R&D space. It's another institutional R&D entity, but it is also organized around personal, face-to-face great group creation. So it takes the two sides of the equation that we treated as two entirely different classes. It is putting them together, right? That's why DARPA follows after our discussion of the great group class. That's who Licklider is finding. He's finding these amazing great groups, and we've seen some of them before. I mean, these are all, who's who of the history of computer science. We talked about Doug Engelbart. There he is, right? He's someone that Lick finds and supports, even though the Stanford Research Institute doesn't know what he's doing, right? They don't know what he's doing there. But, he does this, unbelievable demonstration that with all this kind of breakthrough material. At MIT, Project Mac is right there at Technology Square. You can kind of recognize that building on the lower left. So after Licklider leaves DARPA, he goes to join Project Mac, but meanwhile it gets stood up by Ferdinand Carbato and Bob Fano, and amazing. I mean, the history of what comes out of that place, and it's all DARPA funded, is just breathtaking. So when you go by that building at Technology Square, I think it's 500 Technology Square, take off your hat, because amazing stuff, absolutely amazing stuff occurred there. Within MIT, there's this fascinating conflict. There are two competing visions of computer science fighting for the same DARPA money, right? So Marvin Minsky, great roboticist, great, one of the all-time greats, just died recently, amazing figure. Minsky had this vision that computer thinking would be superior to people's thinking. So he has the artificial intelligence laboratory, and he's running that vision. And then Licklider and Carbato and Fano are running the computer as our friend. It's going to be a symbiotic relationship. We're going to do personal computing, right? Very different ideas battling each other for funding. It took years of negotiation to put together CSAIL because you had these two different visions that competed with each other. And it was, just like we talked about, the competition over the genome, last week in the great group session. This was one of those great competitions. Each side is pushing each other. And, Minsky and team would do unbelievable robotics stuff, and they would say, top this, right? And the Mac team would come back with responses. So it was a wonderful competition going on here. But creating CSAIL required two co-directors at the outset, right? Somebody from computer science and somebody from artificial intelligence. It's kind of settled down. They're all in the same project now, but that was a 20-year or longer project to get there. So it's a remarkable, set of communities, including Project Mac at MIT, but that's just one of them that gets created. So all the early computer science departments are funded by DARPA. DARPA really creates them. That's why there is computer science that's so deep and rich in the United States. And it's Licklider's kind of three research priorities at DARPA are time sharing, which is really interactive computing, right? And that's like personal computing. And then graphics and modeling. And another great name, Ivan Sullivan, ran that piece. And that's early computing graphics. And then networking. And Bob Taylor, who we talked about last week, who goes to Xerox PARC, comes out of DARPA to do that. And that's where he gets his stuff, right? And he and Larry Roberts as well are the ones that lead the effort to stand up computing. And Liu Yao told us about him last week. We sent around his obit because he just died this past week. It's a wonderful obit, if you all get a chance to read it, that appeared in the New York Times. The ARPANET gets created. So Licklider creates this thing at DARPA. He has 2 different stints at DARPA, right? So he's there for several years in each stint. But he creates a community that keeps carrying on the projects. In other words, they agree on what the agenda is and they keep working down the list together. So DARPA isn't always able to do this. Often there's a real problem when a program manager leaves after their 3 to 5 year stint. What happens to their work, right? Who does the follow-on? But Licklider builds this community that keeps the project going for way over a decade and a half. And Taylor and Larry Roberts out of Lincoln Lab really lead the effort to do the internet. They hire BB&N, Licklider's old firm, to actually carry it out. And that's done, right here in Cambridge. So the internet gets done just up the road. And it's, I won't go into the whole story about it, but it's, 2 great things occur in 1969. We go to the moon and we do the internet. And in 1969, nobody had ever heard of the internet. But in the end, which is the more significant, right? And that's going on just up the street here. It's a pretty breathtaking moment. These are some of the figures. This is Vince Cerf and Bob Kahn, who are lead the whole protocol effort, TCP/IP, the whole internet protocol system that's really at the heart of the internet system. It's Larry Roberts, who came out of Lincoln Lab, persuades the DARPA director to use email. So DARPA is like an early email user. So everybody in DARPA goes on email, right? They nurture this thing along. They're one of the early user bases. It becomes the system of communication because DARPA is using it for the entire ARPANET community. It's originally stood up with about 5 universities, linked. The real problem they've got is that because DARPA is trying to stand up these early computer science departments and lots of breakthroughs are happening in computing, DARPA is having to spend a fortune buying new computers for each one of its university research centers. And it's costing them a fortune. They're spending their money on the next generation of computer advance. And one of the reasons they have to do the internet is that, if they only had to buy one computer and everybody could get on it, it would be a gigantic money saver and they'd be able to do much more stuff. So they have this internal reason. Now, the external reason for the internet is much more complicated. One of the reasons is that it's going to be a secure communication system at the time of terrible threats. Now, you all probably don't have much recollection of 9/11, but sure enough, the only way we knew about each other on 9/11 was because the internet still worked. The phone system with New York City went down in a flash. And it worked, right? It turned out to be an enormously important fallback communication system because it is so resilient. In other words, you can establish those network lines essentially through any connection, not just a straight one-to-one kind of connection like the phone system. So that was part of the rationale for developing the internet, but frankly, Licklider had a vision of what the internet was going to be, which is really why they did it, and then they had this excuse of trying to reduce their computer budget for buying fancy computers for all their computer science departments around the country at universities. So it's an amazing story. We heard the story from Liu Yao last week about how personal computing comes about. A lot of that community is being came right out of Licklider support of university research groups, and then moves over to carry it out at Xerox PARC. And then, of course, Xerox PARC isn't able to do it, as you explained. But luckily, Steve Jobs buys the rights to walk through and see the stuff, and he's a great implementer. All right, Steph, what did I miss?
The one part that I would really emphasize to set up the questions is something that Bill touched on, which is that there was a very significant dispute between the scientists and engineers who were trying to create the integrated system versus the sort of isolated, siloed systems. And that ends up playing a big role in, I think, how many of you perceived the readings and the kinds of questions that you asked. I think the place where I'd like to start our conversation is about the mechanisms by which the sort of computing revolution was created, with a question from Beth. And she poses, how much of a technological revolution is the scientific breakthrough versus the vision of how to use it? So I think that really gets at the heart of whether or not a technology can be sort of disruptive or revolutionary versus whether the implementation is what actually matters, as you just noted with Steve Jobs.
Well, just to clarify, like when you say vision, do you mean like JCR's vision, or do you mean like the visionary who comes after, which is Steve Jobs? Like, which vision are you talking about?
Well, I think we'll let Beth clarify.
I think it is kind of like a cumulative process. Like the reason that Steve Jobs was able to have a vision was because JCR had his vision. So it's kind of like at each step in the road, like the reason that we were able to progress was because of the vision, or was it because of technology, or was it this guy was at the right place at the right time? Like how else could things have progressed if it had been under different circumstances?
So how much weight, I guess, are we giving the invention, the mechanism by which this was achieved on its own?
Well, I mean, I think a good way to think about it is like, like Asian dynasties. There's like one that took a while and didn't do anything that was like that significant, right? But they build out the infrastructure so that a dynasty comes right after, and they end up doing all these awesome things, and everyone talks about that one. So I think it's kind of like, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates have a voice because they're getting billionaires. Everyone's like, there's like a saying where I wish I was rich so then people would listen to me, right? So it's like people pay attention because they became wealthy. Especially, and they kind of popularized the idea of the engineer, and they gave a lot of respect to the engineer because now they make money. But in the past, like in the 70s, there's a couple series and a couple like biographies where there's really, really brilliant people that might be, I would even say more brilliant than some people today in those technologies, but they just weren't valued economically or socially, right? Like in the 70s, like being a nerd was like being a nerd. Nowadays, being a nerd is like, damn, he might be a billionaire, would be nice to him, right? So like, I mean, now it's cool to be a nerd, right? To be smart, but it was a thing back then.
I think we'll hit that point again in a second, so keep that thought process.
You think Steve and Bill Gates had that vision socially, like we're gonna make being a nerd cool again because we're gonna make a whole bunch of money?
Hmm?
You think they had that vision when they were, being nerds and making money, that we're gonna make basically like being a nerd cool because we're gonna make money?
What I'm saying is like, so it's the difference between like, I'm the really, like, somebody gets a car, somebody has a Rolls Royce, right? And somebody has like a Toyota, right? Like this first wave.
Well, Licklider would have a junker. Licklider would have a junker.
Yeah.
That he personally would build.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that it's an item that doesn't touch the hands of a lot of people, so it's not valued. Versus like the personal computer was a big thing because everyone could interact with it and would be able to communicate with it. Like these big computers, there's only if you were in an institution, if you were probably like a grad student or like more brilliant, that you got to interact with the computer. And what they really did was just make it common for everybody to use. And that's what the entrepreneur, the Gates, Ford, is somebody who takes a complicated technology and simplifies it to the point where it can touch a large subset of consumers, if not all consumers, right? Any other questions?
Oh, I'm okay with. Sorry, I'm comfortable with silence. So I like it when people think.
What I thought was interesting about this, though, that I connected is when you think about startups or like any like I guess like vision organization, it always starts. Reid Hoffman talks about this, which is you want to have a key insight about society, right? So not a lot of people know this, but Mark Zuckerberg was a psychology major. He just happened to take computer science classes, and then would say that he studied computer science because it was easier when he got into the marketplace and he had to get investors. JCR was psychology, so he had a main insight into how the human brain worked, and also like a secret about human nature that it seemed that he used that to his advantage in order to create the computer systems, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo Martine's point here. I think a lot of his kind of visionary insight was built off of a lot of things that he did. So he had all his tactile knowledge to be able to build cars and things like that. But like, as you can see, probably used that psychology background a lot more when he was trying to figure out how are we going to put together and really move personal computing forward. And I think another understated point here was in this great groups model. I think he, in Licklider, definitely sort of not only underscores, but kind of creates that great groups model for DARPA by not only kind of bringing it together and like finding these people, but I think you mentioned like a lot of these projects weren't on the sort of normal 3 to 5 years, but he took maybe 4 or 5 different collaborators and said like, we're gonna build out 10 years, 15 years, and then just kind of stay working on the same projects and solve all these 5 different problems so we can move the whole field forward instead of just kind of focusing on like 1 or 2 problems. And so he kind of, in this great groups model, he like creates great groups within DARPA and in that leadership as well and kind of moves that forward. And so he's obviously using his psychology kind of insight and research maybe a little bit more than his computing aptitude.
I think it's also cool because I remember in the reading we talked about the cool thing about being an entrepreneur in DARPA is that you get to be an entrepreneur in multiple things at once. So like if you're an entrepreneur, you only have your business and you can only really like focus on that. But like an entrepreneur in DARPA who leads a vision gets to touch multiple projects at once, and you can kind of see that with like JCR where he had his 3 sections. But what I find is interesting is like why isn't he more famous? Because this is like the first time I heard of him, honestly. And he probably did like he probably should get more credit than like maybe like a Jobs or a Bill Gates. And even like in the papers about Bill Gates, he was like, oh well, yeah, we really did this revolution in the 70s, and it's like yeah, you did the last 2%. Like, so it's it was pretty interesting.
Right. He is an absolutely remarkable figure, and the core was this vision that he had, and this image of a crossover, right? Often great technologies are crossover technologies, right? When Jobs creates the iPod, he's taking an MP3 player of high quality and certain new attributes, but he's joining with something entirely different, a remarkable way of organizing the music industry, right? And it's 2 pieces that get joined together. And that's at the heart, I think, of what Licklider is able to do. He's able to take his capability at computing and his engineering and computing capabilities, but he crosses it with this whole background and set of understandings that he comes to with psychology. And it's that crossover that makes him an absolutely unique figure. So when you all are thinking about how to do great stuff, just keep that crossover idea. Bringing something from here and moving it over here is really at the heart of a tremendous amount of creativity. It may be the definition of creativity, right? Is what he pulls off. And, and this, by the time, Licklider finishes his second stint, which he's not as happy at DARPA the second time around, he has a director that he doesn't get along with as well as he did with Jack Rowena, another famous DARPA director named Heilmeyer, excuse me. But that team of his has worked their way through those 3 critical projects. I mean, they've done the internet by '69. They've done desktop computing, carried out with some DARPA support by largely ex-DARPA funded folks at Xerox PARC. And then they've done computer graphics, and a lot of that moves over to Xerox PARC as well, and then from there to Apple. But they've worked their way through those pieces. Let me just mention the film here briefly. And, you know, Rashid, we'll get to this in a second, although we'll let Steph do a couple more questions. The film is this desperate attempt by these people who have created the internet. And you saw them. I mean, this is an amazing collection. I mean, there are a lot of them are on the film, right? Larry Roberts is there, and Frank Hart, who led the BB&N team, and Bob Kahn is on the BB&N team, then goes to DARPA and works with Vince Cerf on the TCP/IP Internet Protocol system, and Paul Baran, who has a vision for how to put together the whole packet switching system to begin with that's at the core of the internet. All these famous internet pioneers are all put together on the film, and they're desperate, right? They are desperate because the internet has only gone to about 50 different university computer science departments, and they realize that they've got this earth-shattering communication system, and they're trying to explain desperately to, on a 16 millimeter film what they've accomplished. It's, and yet it's not, they do this in I think it's 72, they do the film. It's not until really 1993, 1994 that the internet completely scales up. So it's a long, hiatus. And NSF actually plays a very, very important role in the scale up because it gets turned over by DARPA to NSF. And NSF under Eric Bloch, who is the only NSF director who came out of industry. So Eric Bloch was one of the leaders of the IBM 360 project, and was a winner of the President's Medal of Technology, but he was an IBM official, he wasn't a scientist. So he gets leadership of NSF, and he creates NSF's very strong computing organization, pulls one of the leaders of DEC to run it, and they treat computing as a full science. I mean, that's another moment in Licklider's vision. It's when NSF starts to treat computer science as a true science, not just a nice tool for other scientists to play with. So that's a pretty critical moment too. And Eric Bloch and some others understand the power of the internet as a communication system in science. And then they spread it to universities all over the place. That creates a fabulous early audience, and then it scales, right? So that's kind of what plays out there. But, it's another kind of remarkable part of the story here. Steph, let's go to a question or two more.
Great. I have precisely two more questions. The first of which is about a sentiment that was shared in the last couple of pages in the reading. And I'll read a quote now. It says, "Technology isn't destiny. No matter how inexorable its evolution may seem, the way its capabilities are used is as much a matter of cultural choice and historical accident as is politics or fashion." And I think back to maybe the first or the second course, where we began to reflect about the role of culture and technology transfer and technology adoption. And in thinking about the sort of functionalist ethics that we might have, this is by Amartya Sen. He's a very famous economist who came out of India in developmental economics. And thinking about the ways in which we are evaluating vision. And it seems, and I have a couple of notes here from which I will read, that many of the people who we have truly regarded as innovators and as transformative members of society have created things that are effectively public goods. They've really approached technology and engineering from a utility ethics framework, right? Not so much about having that bias to commercialization like maybe Steve Jobs did, but it was the Licklighters, right, and the Edisons who really thought about how they could create a product that was going to transform society for everyone. It wasn't going to be a product that was going to be accessible only to the few. And so, in thinking about our sort of ethics of commercialization today, perhaps, I thought it would be worth it to become a little philosophical in the sense that Licklider was very philosophical about the role that technology played in the development of society, and ask ourselves about the ways in which our commercialization bias may be precluding us from creating the so-called disruptive inventions that we so wish to pursue.
So I think it's a cool question because you get to do sort of both, bring in, just like you said, a lot of the cultural aspects that might be sort of overlooked when you have this sort of commercialization bias. But I'm not sure, or in this context, I think Licklider's got a head up because the field is sort of wide open. And so nobody's really thought about personal computing before, so he gets to really define the field and just make it general enough so that it can be applicable sort of everywhere. But in every sense, you get the idea that time sharing and all these things, he's trying to make computing a lot more accessible. And so I think that's a really cool and seminal thought to like make things more accessible, and that'll give you the sort of innovative, transformative, and then really disruptive ideals to sort of bring this technology from, one and kind of spread it around. And so this spreading effect, I'm not sure how to kind of quantify it, like maybe like Licklider did, but I'm interested in kind of what projects that DARPA might be running now or might be looking at to see if like there's still those people within the organization that are looking at kind of bringing technologies that might exist now that might just be kind of primordial or high risk, and kind of spreading that to more normative phase, maybe like Licklider did.
It's an interesting point, Steph, that you raise, and Rashid, that you comment on, because there's a very strong culture in computing, including a very strong culture in MIT computing, that computing should be free and computing should be in the commons and computing should serve us all. And that's actually a very strong ethos that, in a way, and I think it's your point, comes out of the way in which Licklider and that remarkable team evolved this technology, because this is not a for-profit operation. They are essentially trying to, spring a transformative technology onto the world by building it in the commons, right, and creating it into the commons and making it universally accessible. That's a remarkable project. That's not normally the way we do stuff, in a capitalist country. So you've identified an interesting kind of strand here that's a different kind of technology development story. And it's a different story than the Edison story, right? And it's, it enables, Martine, as you point out, Gates and Jobs to get extremely rich. But all the foundational stuff was kind of thrown into the commons long ahead of them, which was an enabler for them as well. So interesting. Thanks for bringing the philosophy in.
And I don't think, for what it's worth, I personally think that doing good is not exclusive mutually with doing well for yourself and for other people. I think that there's a lot of value in thinking about the ways in which you can reach a wide audience and, transform society, and at the same time do well for yourself and then return that value onto society. But to what extent, the kinds of people who are capitalizing on the gains of, the Lickliders, I'm not sure that they may all share my vision for the world.
I'll add a point to that. I think a lot of it matters. It matters how you define success, like what channel is creating wealth, right? Because you'd say, well, yeah, these innovators didn't become wealthy, right? Or the U.S. didn't become wealthy. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs became wealthy, and they're employees, right? But at the same time, how much net worth was increased in the U.S. based on the economic output, based on these people, and also their legacy? Because most likely in the future we'll re-look into this and say, actually, these were the pioneers, and then they get even way more traction. Because Bob Metcalf, who made Ethernet, made the original one, and then other people implemented it and made it better and better and better. So he's like, oh, it's awesome because I get credit for all these brilliant things people did after me. So I wouldn't be able to do any of this, but I get all this credit. And I think there's another sector that I could compare to, which is space, right? So NASA went very fast and used a lot of resources in order to go into space. And they really set the framework, and now they're I listened to an astronaut talk about it, and he said that, our job is to kind of widen the horizons, because it's going to be a while till it's commercially viable for other people to do, right? But that's our job, to really go to the places where a capitalist can't go. But there's a net positive on our society because of it. And that's kind of the job of government, right? To do the stuff that individuals can't do for the net positive of the society. So I think there is a lot of, there is a wealth creation there. They create a wealth of knowledge. They get respected and honored much higher, maybe. So I think it really depends how you define it, right?
I think
How
that
about a
sets us-
closing thought, Steph?
Yeah, that sets us up for the closing thought, which was really about Licklider's legacy. I really appreciated that Bill had us read the component in which the author is having his wife Linda reflect on Lick and the ways in which he sort of passed away, and the reaction from the computing community about not only his legacy, but the ways in which he had been such an incredible not only mentor but champion, which is a word that you use today, sort of maybe for the first time, right? The kinds of mentors that one can have. There's the people who will help you learn things, and then there's the people who will advocate for you. And Lick was really the champion of computing, not only for so many people but for the field itself, with ARPA being his champion. And I think there's a lot to be said for finding those mentors, and I hope that we in this room have found those mentors in our own lives, or are on the path to finding those people, and that MIT and our institutions generally help to connect us with the people who will help us make the revolutions that we want to see happen.
Great, thank you. Rashid, a couple of thoughts about the film clip.
Yeah. So I think the film clip was for me a little bit weird to watch because it was kind of really putting a face and a name and a voice to all these people that we just kind of read about. And they came out about as I expected, especially because I think the audience of the film was really trying to make the internet and kind of ideas in computing a lot more palatable for the general audience. And so it was nice to see them kind of struggle with translating what they do on the daily basis in their research, which is highly technical, to sort of general population. And I think this might be a good time to ask, are these sort of efforts that DARPA should be doing kind of normally to take these high, kind of very technical research base, you might need a PhD to understand what's going on a project, and then really translating it for that public good of really disseminating scientific information.
So to rephrase the question, you're asking basically, should DARPA be engaging in high-risk, high-reward stuff?
A little bit louder, please.
I'm trying to figure out. So I was thinking, is the question basically that should DARPA be engaging in relatively technical projects that might have really huge impacts to society, or?
I think more so, should DARPA, with each project that they take on, should they be advocating to the general public as much as possible?
Should there be a communication component
Okay.
to the research that they do, much like they'll be doing this weekend at the Science March or the Climate March next weekend?
Is DARPA going to be there?
I don't know. Will they?
It's an interesting point about DARPA, because in the IT revolution, DARPA is working to stand up that revolution essentially in the civilian economy, right? Not in a closed system defense economy. And there were conscious decisions that DARPA made there. So the military is often pretty good at getting that first prototype out, right? The initial kind of breakthrough prototype. What it doesn't really have the resources to do are the relentless series of follow-on incremental advances. And clearly, the IT revolution that we've been living through for the last 25 years is predominantly incremental advances, some of which can be obviously quite significant, right? But the basic framework was kind of in place more than 20 years ago, and we've been in effect building on that. And DARPA understood that the military would never have the resources, that it can really use this personal computing kind of system and the internet system. There would be incredible tools to create a whole new organizational set of mechanisms for the military. But it was going to stand it up in the civilian sector, and then the military could buy it back from the civilian sector after the civilian sector did all the incremental work and flooded the sector with investment. So, for a long period of time, the military was the principal spender on computing and on software, right? It dominated as the big buyer in that sector for actually a fairly significant period of time. That era is long gone. The military's control of these sectors is, infinitesimally small now because they've been stood up and the military buys them back. So that's a different kind of way for DARPA to operate. And the next piece we're going to do in a second we're going to talk about DARPA developing technologies within the military, right? And how it operated in that way, which is in some ways, quite challenging. Closing thought on the film? A question?
Just really short. I mean, I do think there is some value for DARPA to do it at the very least in today's society. Having worked on like a DARPA funded project, people generally you talk to like, oh yeah, DARPA's just like a money sinkhole. They just have a ton of money, and a lot of people don't necessarily see how this defense agency's research comes down to benefit them. So even if they're all public image.
Yeah. So as a closing thought, I think DARPA has the advantage where they can do sort of this high risk, high reward, and under the guise of defense, I think they kind of get away with not being able to say, or kind of being able to be like it's classified, or like we don't really have to tell you under the kind of defense parameters or kind of protocols, or the reasons why we want to look into these projects can be a little bit more complicated. But I do see, and in cases like this, where like you have ARPANET, which obviously has great potential if you do that tech transfer and like move it into the civilian sector, and then you get the sort of IT revolution that follows on after. And so I think it's important for DARPA to kind of keep initiatives like this for maybe bigger projects that are a lot easier to kind of stand up in civilian sectors.
Yeah, an important point, Rashid. DARPA gets a lot of slack because it's under that national security mission banner. So it's able to take the kind of risks and aim for a set of breakthroughs that's harder for a civilian agency to undertake. I mean, this is wild stuff, right? I mean, think about coming up with this stuff in the 1960s. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And that national security justification was pretty key. All right, so now we're going to look at a different side of DARPA. This is a chapter from our textbook. And there's a couple of topics here. DARPA is a very unique institutional model that operates at both the personal and institutional levels, as we talked about, and then secondly, DARPA's organizational rule set. DARPA also creates lots of the foundational technologies behind what is called the revolution in military affairs. So, here's the setting. Harold Brown and Bill Perry are running Jimmy Carter's Defense Department. So Harold Brown's Secretary of Defense, he's president of Caltech. And Perry is out of Stanford. They are great technologists, right? Imagine the top leadership of the Defense Department in the hands of, really hotshot technologists. Doesn't usually happen. And they've got a big problem on their hands. The problem is the American Army in particular has been completely demoralized by the Vietnam War and is largely disintegrated. It is not, in many ways, a truly functioning force. And the Cold War is heating up, and there's a monster presence of Soviet and Allied armies in Eastern Europe. And the problem that Brown and Perry have got is that because the US Army is weak and perceived as weak, there's kind of nothing in the way of that Soviet Army having the capability of moving right into Western Europe. And that's not a good situation, because then you have to decide whether to use nuclear weapons very quickly. You don't have a lot of time. You've got to decide whether you use nuclear weapons, which essentially means ending the world. It's not the kind of decision you want to have to make. So Perry and Brown start thinking about what they call an offset strategy. Can we start to restore the strength of the American military? They're not going to do it with a mass army and a citizen army and building thousands of tanks and adding millions to the military. That's unaffordable, and it's not going to happen. And they'd be putting those people into a broken institution anyway. So the Army is in the process of restoring itself through leadership of people like Colin Powell and a whole generation of kind of new Army leaders that really restore that operation in a remarkable kind of way. It restores itself. But that is an underway project at that time. And what Perry and Brown start is a whole set of thinking about, can we get a significant on-the-ground conventional warfare superiority so that the Soviet Union won't even think about coming through the Fulda Gap and moving on Western Europe. And that's what they embark on, right? And that becomes DARPA's job. So DARPA develops precision strike, they develop stealth, and they develop UAVs or drones as core. And then they're also doing a lot of stuff with submarines that nobody ever talks about. So I don't know what that is, right? Something's going on there with submarines, right? Undersea warfare. But we know about the other three. We have a pretty good idea what those look like. And these are not technologies that the services want, right? The Air Force is dominated by pilots. They don't want drones. That's like the last thing they want. The Air Force wants airplanes that can actually fly. They don't want these stealth things that if the computers weren't continually adjusting, the exact movement of the aircraft, it would fall like a rock, right? It's completely unmaneuverable. It's like flying a bus, right? No, really. These are not maneuverable. Nobody can see them, but it's still a bus. So the Air Force doesn't want this thing, right? But DARPA, in the case of stealth, working with Lockheed, which does some fascinating translation of actually Russian scientific literature and develops the concept of stealth, and then DARPA jumps on it with Lockheed and the Skunk Works, works on developing stealth. It's working on precision strike. It completely changes warfare. Completely changes warfare. In the Gulf War, which was where all this stuff got shown and demonstrated, and that's where this phrase revolution in military affairs comes from. The Russians saw this stuff. Revolution in military affairs is their term for what we pulled off, right? They were stunned, right? That these technologies created a whole new kind of capability on the ground for the US military that was just, they had no defense against. We were essentially up against a Soviet trained and style army in the Gulf War in Iraq. And their air defense system fell apart in a very short period of time. They could not deal with stealth, they could not deal with the drones. This continuous battlefield awareness, the airline battle doctrine that was enabled by these different technologies created an entirely different kind of military force. So DARPA is doing this stuff, but this stuff gets stood up within the military. It's hard to think of what the civilian application, we're now working away at civilian applications on drones. So that's transferring over. That could be pretty interesting. It's already starting to get interesting. GPS is another part of that story. That's already long since transferred over, that DARPA works on helping to nurture. Maybe stealth will transfer over, because if we do something resembling autonomous vehicles, you really want inverse stealth so that the radar systems can really see your vehicle, right? That they're not going to miss you in the noise, right? So inverse stealth, cars could look a lot weirder, right? If they go stealth, but inverse stealth, but that may be what we need to do in order to make these autonomous vehicle systems really operable. Max?
Oh, you're saying autonomous cars. Okay.
Yeah, autonomous cars. I'm sorry, not drones. Cars.
I was thinking, why would you want your drones to be visible?
Yes, you have a car that looks like the other side of stealth, right? So these are all, the military is a legacy sector, right? It's been around since 1787. It's extremely resistant to change. It has its routines and doctrines, and it has its doctrines that govern how it fights and so forth. And then here are Perry and Brown and DARPA landing in the middle, forcing them to adopt completely disruptive technologies from what they've been doing. So DARPA is operating here as a change agent within a legacy sector military. It's able to do the change agent role because of the island bridge model, right? Remember, we talked about this at Xerox PARC, right? DARPA has got a bridge to the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense is able to make its stuff stick with the military. And that's a really key DARPA capability. That's also a lesson about how to bring change into legacy sectors. So DARPA rules of small and flexible, and it's a flat organization, and it allows a lot of freedom and autonomy outside bureaucratic impediments to its program managers, and it has an incredibly talented technical staff, and it works off the challenge model. The end of a project is the end of the project. DARPA shuts things down. It just doesn't persevere forever. If it doesn't seem to be working, it'll close it down. It's got all those rule sets, but in addition, it's got some other capabilities that I think are important to understanding how to bring change into legacy sectors. Form critical innovation institutions, right? That's a lesson that we're seeing here. The Defense Department would not have done the Revolution in Military Affairs if there wasn't a critical innovation system there to do the innovation, i.e. DARPA, right? So that's kind of a new rule for us to think about, right? What's going to be that critical innovation system that can operate as a change agent? Because most of the economy is legacy sectors. Point 2, use this island bridge model. It's really critical. Remember, Edison can call up JP Morgan and get JP Morgan to fund the electrical system, right? That island bridge thing is absolutely critical. Get your innovation team on a protected island and make sure they have a route back. And DARPA is a great example of that. Build a thinking community, right? That's what the Licklider story is about, right? This is not just Licklider having a vision. He's able to create a whole thought community within DARPA and then by all the people that are working for DARPA, like, you know, Doug Engelbart and that whole world out there. So they're able to scale up this community so that it reaches a certain kind of mass and can get a lot of stuff done and a lot of thinking done and develop and nurture a lot of ideas. So when you're thinking about implementing your technologies, think about building that thinking community. And then another key piece here is linking the technologists to the operators. So if the technologists are only talking to themselves and they are not talking to the people actually operating the system, nothing will happen. So you've got to make sure, as you're working on bringing your technologies about, that you've got linkages to the actual operators. So these are a few more lessons from DARPA. And look, I'm going to go ahead and do Glenn Fong here because he's got some, you know, sort of pieces about, and Max, you've got Glenn, right? Okay. Glenn just kind of tells us what we talked about earlier, that so much of the IT revolution really came out of this kind of DARPA-supported thinking community. So Glenn argues that the Apple Lisa and then its Mac really came from Xerox PARC's Alto, as we've discussed, and then in turn Microsoft's Windows really came from Apple's Mac, right, which in turn came back from, you know, Xerox PARC, which in turn came from this kind of DARPA community. So the key staff from PARC go to Apple and to Microsoft as implementers on the pieces of the vision that they're pursuing. And it's all Lick's kids, right? It's this community that Licklider starts to establish. So Bob Taylor's, as Luyal led us through last week, he leads PARC. The DARPA-funded university research centers at places like MIT and Berkeley and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and SRI in Utah, they support and train a lot of that Xerox PARC staff. So by creating the early computer science departments and funding them, DARPA is training a whole thinking community here. And, you know, this is just a list of famous computer scientists that got their support from DARPA. And this is who did it, right? This is that community. And it's a stunning set of realizations as to just how central DARPA is at the whole follow-on to the IT revolution. So Glenn Fong kind of brings us to this set of realizations. You know, things like Ed Catmull at Lucasfilms, right? You know, it's a remarkable, you see where the strands lead and often all kinds of directions. So you get a sense for just what a great foundational institution this is. So let's do some questions and points about these two readings. And Rashid, do you want to lead us off on the chapter from the textbook, and then we'll go to Max.
Yeah.
So I think what's really important in this chapter is it kind of highlights the elements of DARPA that make it kind of so fantastic and able to do all the things that it's able to do. So we talked about sort of the island bridge and things like that, but really the success of also the program managers acting as sort of like mini change agents to be able to be that small and flexible. And so I think somebody asked actually a pretty good question, which was, is there a way to sort of bring these elements of DARPA, kind of giving these dynamic program managers the freedom to do the things that they want to do? Is there a way to do that outside of this DARPA model, and to maybe link enterprise to this model? I think Martine asked a question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, yeah, I just thought it was really interesting because, like in business, a lot of time you talk about focusing on your alphas and getting rid of your betas. So the stuff that you're really, really good at, focus on doing that. Stuff you're not good at, don't do it. So you try to outsource everything. So it'd be an interesting model because you might move faster. And so that's what I was kind of thinking of. A way of like people with good ideas that are very capable, being linked with resources in a much better manner to maybe be able to do more. I don't know.
So I just want to interject. I think you just described the MIT faculty who could hire postdocs and students to do things that they might not want to do, and they specialize.
I mean, the way I would think about it differently is it's like, I mean, they're very book smart, right? And like, what kind of person would come into like through MIT faculty, right? Versus like people that might be. I mean, look at like the people like Apple, Steve Jobs drop out, Bill Gates kind of drop out. So it's like, I think you're definitely right, but I guess the way I was trying to say it is more. Well, I mean, you are right. It's more that I meant more of like a spectrum of like personality types.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know. I mean, you guys see the research that they do. I mean, a lot of these faculty that I come across have spin out companies, and no, they're not all becoming Bill Gates overnight, but they're all very much into their own specialty and
well, the research model is a very productive model because you have somebody who has key insights, but he doesn't have the time to go and make a company out of it. So you get somebody who's one of their grad students.
Exactly.
I forget who's the professor who has like a 10 patents, you probably know.
Oh God, which one?
In the
Langer?
biology,
I mean,
yeah, I'm thinking about Langer.
Yeah.
But I mean, but also like research institutions try to focus more on they're called like frog innovations, like you move forward. And so like I was thinking more of hawk innovations, which is just a completely different field that no one's looking into because it doesn't seem to be that productive.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're a bunch of frogs, is that what you say?
No, it's like in general the type of research that goes through.
Yeah.
It has to have a purpose that's already kind of defined.
Yes.
Based on a current paradigm.
Yeah.
So it's very risky to do anything different because you're kind of ruining your thesis.
Yeah. Well, and you have to get money from somebody to do it and convince them it's going somewhere. Yeah. Okay.
So how does that fit in with like what you're saying with the alphas and betas, where you focus in on what you're really good at? I mean, if people aren't doing necessarily something because they don't see it as is it important to keep those things?
Say that a little
Well,
louder.
I think the idea that he's trying to get at is that you focus on what you're good at, but in order to figure out what you're good at, you have to have some failures along the way, right? So you have to try new different things, and then maybe you find out, oh, this idea is really amazing. It'll make lots of money, and we happen to know what we're doing. But you might have like a dozen things that don't go so well before that. So it's a process.
I mean, you might come up with a key insight in terms of manufacturing, but you haven't done large scale manufacturing. So how are you going to connect to a firm that already understands that really well, so they can execute quickly? So you try to figure it out. It'll take you a lot of capital. It'll take you 2 or 3 years, and you're just kind of like screwed. I was thinking more of like, in software you have Amazon Web Services, you have databases that are already huge that you can just go port and you're through. And it'd be interesting for that for like manufacturing or biology, because also biology is super difficult because like say you want to do a startup, you just get the regions as a pain.
So I guess obviously it's going to vary along different fields, but I think manufacturing might be an interesting one, or even biology, and the kind of intricacies there. But I think this brings up sort of a larger point, which is an even kind of bigger abstract question, but follows along with this idea of kind of creating these change agents. And so somebody asked, is there this sense that these change agents, like the ones that are found in DARPA, is it important to sort of create these change agents by kind of giving you a whole bunch of money and kind of letting you do use your own discretion as project managers to kind of figure out what you want to do, or to sort of find these people that are doing sort of these fringe research opportunities that might be high risk and they might not just have the funding, and kind of go from there. And so it's do you want to create these change agents by kind of giving it to the people that you think are capable, or do you want to go out and find these people who may not be kind of proven in their field yet, or might not have research that is they're still at this high risk phase?
Could I ask a clarifying question? Do you mean in the context of DARPA, or do you mean generally?
I would say generally, because DARPA kind of, you have a model that's established already.
Okay. I guess the reason I asked that is because it in one of the readings for today, I believe it was it might have been the Fong reading actually. There's a quote from that technologist who said that he wanted the government to not touch engineers at all. He said, if the U.S. wants more good jobs, better lives, and a stronger economy, the best thing lobbyists, bureaucrats, and politicians can do is leave us alone. And so that's why I thought it was interesting if you were asking in the context of DARPA or in the context of an organization that was funded by government dollars, because maybe the implication is in this instance for this person who is rejecting the notion that government played any role in the computational revolution at all is we don't want government help, but maybe the model that they actually want is give us the money and then don't mess with us at all.
Reports. Don't make
Yeah,
us do
exactly.
this.
Don't. Yeah.
The time
That's
was
spoken
so
like
stuff.
someone who's done some annual reports before.
Is that the VC? Is that like from Dragusin?
This is from Draper.
Draper?
It's on page 234 if you're interested in looking at it.
I think I remember the quote, yeah. I mean, I think what he meant is more like, please don't put more regulations that I have to deal with when I'm trying to innovate. It keeps getting in the way.
I like Beth's point too, though. What is the? If I could ask, I'm so sorry, Lily. I like your point too. Could you maybe elaborate in your experience what it's like to sort of innovate under the auspices of working in a team with other people?
Yeah, so I've had experience with National Science Foundation grants, huge NASA Astrobiology Institute grants, and the reporting requirements are intensive. Usually they're on an annual basis. And I think that the intention behind the annual reporting is necessary and good, but often they're extremely cumbersome, and the first year really people are just including stuff that they've already done, or even like inflating what they've accomplished to look good on the report. So those are the only experiences that I've had is with those two funding agencies. But
Yeah, I think DARPA has similar requirements, though. I think their paperwork is
Yeah, I mean, DARPA runs a different kind of operation. There's frankly less paper, but the DARPA program manager at a traditional science agency, the whole decision process is organized around whether or not you get the grant award. And it's getting that award out the door, right? That's how these organizations are really put together. That's what the peer review process and selection process put around. In DARPA, and in in some of the DARPA clones, the program manager, that's like just getting the grant award. That's only stage one. Then the program manager moves into your home, right? They're going to be on you all the time. Someone has described DARPA as, a set of geniuses connected by a travel agent. They spend at least a third of their time on the road, out meeting with their teams, bringing ideas around. They'll typically have a number of teams standing up working on a portfolio of related projects, and they're going to bring ideas from those different teams. They're going to put those teams together to talk to each other, and sometimes that's not easy because they don't want to really share their secrets. So it's a complicated process to manage, but the DARPA manager is there to help the awardee get through the process and work in any way possible to expedite things and move things along. So It's a completely different organizational model for the program manager compared to most science agencies. And the DARPA clones like ARPE or IARPA do the same thing. And we'll talk about ARPE at a later class. But it's just a different model. And there's another capability. We talked earlier about DARPA's capability of working at both the institutional level and at the great groups level. The purpose of this reading about its work within the defense legacy sector is to say that DARPA has been able to do innovation within a legacy sector to a remarkable degree, as well as do innovation like in IT on a complete technology frontier, right? That's a remarkable set of capabilities to build into sort of one place, and yet its model has been able to fit both. So it's another kind of interesting achievement that it's been able to pull off.
Just to go back to, I know like in your book you talk about how when you go to a legacy sector, it's like you're parachuting down and they're shooting at you. I think like for the military, since you're going to a lot of new fields and new areas, it might be easier, and so it's easier to port. But I think like for energy, it might be a lot. I mean, how do you make that distinction? Because I feel other legacy sectors would be a lot harder to come in.
Well, the military is a hard legacy sector because remember the services have the money. They have the procurement budgets. And if they don't want to do it, it's really hard to get them to do it. So that's why that island bridge model is so crucial for DARPA, being able to rely on the Secretary of Defense to kind of override some of the directions where the services want to go. It's still not easy, but all of these three technology areas, precision strike, UAVs, and stealth, were all stood up despite some pretty significant service opposition. Not uniformly, different parts of the services saw what the possibilities were, so I don't want to make that uniform, but it was still tough. These were not easy to implement.
And so to connect to another legacy sector, which is energy. So would you say that ARPA-E has been as successful in kind of doing what DARPA did, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, we'll go through ARPA-E when we get to that class, but I think ARPA-E is very young. It's still very new.
Like 2009, right?
Yeah, it's like 7 years old. So in some ways the jury's still out, and we'll see if they survive. But looks very interesting. So Max, let's do some of Glenn Fong's work.
Okay, so yeah, basically Fong was talking a lot about Park and Xerox and how a lot of the concepts that were developed at Park were eventually taken by Microsoft and Apple and basically created the PC revolution that we all know and love. Yeah, Apple fanboy. So one of the questions that I had while I was reading the Fong reading, maybe someone can clarify this. I didn't really understand. So Parks, a lot of their ideas were taken, virtually everything. So how did Park not respond in any sort of legal way? They could have sued. Was it possibly because they didn't patent anything?
Jobs bought the rights to go through.
Okay.
So he acquired those rights.
I thought it was just like the rights to visit, or like the.
So
I didn't know it was.
Do you know?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I don't know if it was he bought the rights. I know he funded them somehow, and part of that funding was that I get to check out your projects and I get to see like and like take those ideas like how it is.
Okay.
The thing that happened though is like so he takes. It's also hard to. I'll clarify this later, but pretty much he can do that because of the rights, and then Gates could do it because Jobs and Gates were friends. So Jobs showed Gates. He's like, oh look at this cool thing I'm doing, because they're kind of like in different sectors, right?
Yeah.
She's like, oh yeah, like kid, check it out. Like, what do you think? Because he's trying to impress his friend who's also very successful, and Gates is like, whoa. It's pretty great. And then he goes and he copies him and he takes it out.
You're talking about Windows.
Yeah, so he comes out with like, it was a Windows DOS. He comes out with it right before Gates, because this is going to be part of the new Apple computer. And he comes out with it right before, so it looks like Gates did it instead of Jobs. And then Jobs literally goes like, we're done. And so they became, this is the reason Apple became so secretive. They were used to be a lot more open. They became secretive because after that, he's like, any little thing can like go out if somebody finds out. We're not doing this anymore, so it's completely switched to hierarchy. So that's the rights part in terms of like, Jobs does it, and then when Gates copies, when Jobs takes Gates to court, pretty much Gates can say, actually, we both stole it, but it's okay for him, so it's okay for me.
But like
I
you
mean,
just
it's in
said,
the
Jobs
paper.
didn't steal it. He
Hmm?
paid for it.
Well, like,
He
pretty
paid
much
for the
like
rights.
when they go to court, Gates says, "Yeah, we both just took it from the same source. It's not like it was originally Apple's." So that's the element of like the legality.
Uh-huh.
The second part, the reason Park wouldn't do it is because you have this thing called the innovator's dilemma, which is like in any company, you can have a product line. Like a great example is Kodak. They came out with the first digital camera,
Mhm.
but you're already
Today.
making so much money, and you probably have large revenue streams, right? Doing taking pictures of Polaroids, right? So this is like if you're an Ethernet company, if you're 3Com, and you have these wires, you're
Yeah.
putting wires everywhere. It's not like you can go in the next day and it's like, yo,
Wi-Fi
we gotta take
speaker.
all this out. Because it just ruins. Another thing too is like once you become a public company, every single quarter matters. So you can never go back. Really, it's kind of like you can know you're wrong. You have to go for it, or else you're just gonna get kicked off, or you're gonna get sued by your shareholders. It's a very complicated thing to do.
Also, I wonder how much Park staff or Xerox staff there was left to really benefit after all the staff is actually just going to Apple and Microsoft afterward.
Yeah.
So like,
Kind of
it's not that like, yeah, like,
No,
it's
so-
not like I didn't benefit because I was at Xerox and I missed the wave. It's like I just left Xerox to go work at Apple or Microsoft and then I just got the benefits later.
So, Lu Yao, you led us through Xerox PARC very nicely last week. Do you have thoughts on how come Xerox didn't get the Alto and personal computing and graphic interfaces and the mouse out the door?
Yeah, I mentioned last week that they were so much into the research they're doing and so passionate that they didn't consider commercializing or bringing it to the general audience at all. And actually, there's one of the kind of investors came to their meeting room and sat on the beanbag saying, "Okay, I'm the person who can kind of like can you guys show me more and I will kind of commercialize all this, like make it possible." But they didn't. They totally ignored him. So I think they had a chance, but they just didn't have the awareness, I think.
Right. It was a really serious island bridge connection problem.
They were probably missing one or two entrepreneur-spirited scientists in their group that were able to connect the
Right.
market with the innovations.
And part of this is something Martine mentioned earlier, which is Xerox was focused on its core competency, which is photocopies. And they didn't understand this explosion of personal computing capability because it didn't fit their core competency model. So they missed a staggering opportunity. But fortunately, Jobs saved us, so it all worked out.
I call it the beanbag effect.
Too much time on those bean bags, is that your point, Lily? Right, that was a great photograph of the crowd on bean bags. You had a great picture for us, Lily. How about a closing thought, Max, on Fong, or a couple of closing thoughts?
Let's see. So, how about a closing question?
Sure.
All right.
That's fine.
So,
I only let you get one out, so it's all yours.
So one of the questions that someone had previously mentioned was basically, there's this stereotype that government bureaucracy is kind of slow and sluggish and full of red tape and it's horrible. And is it possible that you could use like DARPA as an example to say that maybe this is unfounded, maybe it's not as realistic as people think? And to continue that, there's a couple parts to this question. Is it unfounded? And should the government try to redo its image, for lack of a better phrase? And is there really any advantage that they can get from it?
Can you tell the other question?
What?
Can you just repeat
Yeah, sorry, I know, it started rambling a little bit. So yeah, is the government slow?
Is
Can
DARPA
it-
instance where it's not slow?
Yes. And does the government get any advantage from making itself not look slow?
So let me put a couple of, and it's a really important point, Max. DARPA is stuck in one of the most notorious bureaucracies on the planet, right? And, that dates back to like 1787. So how is it able to do this stuff? It has some very interesting rules and some capabilities that it got. One of its key rules is that it's called Other Transactions Authority. And DARPA's argument is, look, we're not buying jet aircraft, right? We're just buying what's in people's heads to do research. So we don't have to go through all that elaborate procurement process to protect the taxpayers. We're out of the federal procurement system. So DARPA is able to contract with enormous freedom and very quickly, right? And then another DARPA power that they've acquired is that they can have what's called IPA authority, Intergovernmental Personnel Act authority. So ironically, at one point, DARPA was attempting to hire me, and I don't know why they wanted me, because I'm not a technologist, but they seemed to want this. And, you know, I wasn't going to go to DARPA because I'm not a technologist. I wouldn't be at the heart of the operation, right? So it wasn't going to work. But they said they can hire me in a day. They said, you want to do this? You're on tomorrow. This Intergovernmental Personnel Act enables them essentially to enter into a contract with whatever organization you're working for. Maybe it's a university. They buy your services using this Other Transactions Authority so that they can put you on the job almost immediately, right? They use this IPA authority with companies or with universities to be able to hire in lickety-split time. I mean, corporations can't hire this fast, right? Much less universities, much less, government. So they are outside of two of the traditional banes of governmental bureaucratic nightmares. They got themselves free of that authority. And interestingly, both ARPA-E and IARPA, the DARPA clones, have the same capabilities. So that's part of why they're able to act like this. I don't think it's the whole story, but that's a couple of pieces that they've been able to acquire.
I would answer and say, I guess traditionally you would say the government and bureaucracy. That's just like the highlight of what slow is. When you think of something slow, you think of like a congressional session or something like that.
It's deliberate.
It's deliberately so, and then there's an entire argument that we can get into, like, is government supposed to move slow because they need to be this giant political machine that shouldn't be swayed by like just one charismatic or convincing guy. But anyway, I think it's important to understand that like DARPA doesn't move slow because often it doesn't have this opportunity to for like national security reasons. Like it's just not prudent for us to move slow to develop, I guess, like drones and things like that, which might have been, drastic, like things would have been drastically different if someone else had done it first, or if we went into the Gulf War with these capabilities.
I mean, transfer that example to something like genomics. Could you imagine the kinds of implications that it could have on just the fundamental human ethics if they were able to create genetic engineering overnight in the way that DARPA has been able to create things?
Well, I do want to tell you that DARPA now has a very strong biological technologies office. So look out, Steph.
Oh yeah, well it was interesting because at the AAAS meeting in February, one of the sessions that I went to actually with Chuck Weiss, who is Bill's co-author for many of the things, was a panel that included this guy named Gary Marchand, who's a lawyer, ethicist, and genomics engineer, who was talking about the necessity to include sort of a participatory ethics in decision making for genomics. And one of his primary arguments, as I recall it, is truly that if we want to do a good job of implementing this at scale, right, nationally or globally, we also have to do a good job of listening meaningfully to populations and then at the same time meaningfully incorporating their feedback into their creation process. And that's very difficult. And I think that's precisely why government is slow, or the word that I choose to use, deliberate. But it obviously does make innovation really difficult. So, to Max's point, I don't think that DARPA applies, unfortunately, to most things.